Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into Edo, Japan, the city that would one day become Tokyo. But before you imagine delicate cherry blossoms and poetic samurai reciting haiku under the moonlight, no, wipe that away. Edo was the opposite of serene. It was the largest city on Earth in the 1700s, a human sardine can stuffed with nearly 1 million people crammed into houses made of wood, paper, and hope. It was loud, it was smelly, it was fragile, and yet somehow it worked. So dim your lights, get comfortable, maybe roll up your blanket like a futon, and let's wake up in Edo. And remember, if you enjoy wandering through history's stranger streets with me, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Tell me, would you survive in Edo? Or would you be the first one to beg for Uber Eats and soundproof walls? You wake to the sound of your neighbor snoring. No, not because you share a room, but because your walls are made of shoji, paper screens stretched across wooden frames. Paper is not known for its soundproofing qualities, so every cough, sneeze, argument, and midnight stomach grumble from next door comes directly into your ears. Your house is one room, a box. At night, it's your bedroom. During the day, it shapeshifts into your kitchen, dining space, workshop, or storefront. Privacy is as rare as air conditioning. You roll up your futon, shove it against the wall, and instantly, poof, your bedroom has vanished. Now you live in a multi-purpose efficiency unit, centuries before modern real estate marketing could make that sound appealing. And yes, it's crowded. Edo was famously dense. Some areas packed over 100,000 people per square mile. To compare, that's busier than modern-day Manhattan, but without the luxury of elevators or decent plumbing. Forget your iPhone. Forget even a rooster. In Edo, the morning alarm came from the Yomitori, the night watchman. He clapped one's sticks together as he patrolled, chanting the hour in a slow, rhythmic call. It was part timekeeping, part security system, part community ASMR. If you didn't wake to that, you'd wake to the fishmongers, tofu sellers, and sweet potato vendors shouting their sales pitches through the streets at dawn. Every stall owner had their own melodic cry designed to carry across alleys and tug wallets out of sleeves. Imagine your 7 a.m. wake-up call being a man outside your window bellowing, "Tofu! Fresh tofu! Get your tofu here!" And if that didn't rouse you, the smell did. Edo mornings reeked of wood smoke, fried fish, soy sauce, and less pleasant things we'll get to later. Let's be honest, Edo breakfast was modest. If you were wealthy, maybe a merchant or a lucky samurai with stipends that actually covered living costs, you got rice. White rice, steaming hot, with miso soup, a salty pickle, maybe grilled fish. The smell of charred sardines drifted through neighborhoods, taunting those who could only dream of such luxury. If you weren't wealthy, which was most people, it was millet or barley gruel. Imagine oatmeal but rougher, grainier, and deeply unexciting. Edoites joked about rice as the dream food, but millet as the reality. It was filling, at least, which mattered when you'd spend the rest of the day on your feet. But here's the twist. Edo was the biggest consumer city in the world. Food had to be shipped in from every corner of Japan. The rice you ate might have traveled hundreds of miles by boat, arriving in Edo's bustling canals before making its way into a wooden bowl in your tiny one-room home. Step outside, and the city hums. Actually, it shouts. Edo was alive with noise. Children squealing in alleyways, dogs barking, chickens scratching in the dust, street performers playing shamisen, flutes of drums, merchants hollering over each other about their wares, and always the creak of wooden carts on uneven roads. There were no cars, of course, but the constant shuffle of geta, those wooden clogs with teeth, clacked through the streets, creating a sound like 1,000 hollow metronomes marching in unison. Add the smells, grilled eels, soy, the tang of sake being brewed, smoke from cooking fires, and yes, human waste. Because in Edo, sanitation was both ingenious and horrifying. Here's where we get uncomfortable. Edo's waste system relied on night soil collectors. Farmers outside the city actually bought human waste to use as fertilizer. So every morning, carts would rattle through the streets, barrels sloshing with, well, you can guess. It was practical, recycling at its finest. But it also meant Edo smelled like Edo. There's no candle that captures that essence, no matter how much soy sauce and incense you burn. And you thought your morning commute was bad. Edo wasn't just big, it was enormous. In the 1700s, it overtook London and Beijing as the largest city on Earth, topping 1 million residents, all crammed into wooden houses stacked along narrow alleys. That density meant constant fire risk. One spark, one overturned lantern, and entire districts went up in flames. Edo citizens lived with this looming dread daily. And still, they stayed. Why? Because Edo was opportunity. Merchants grew rich, craftsmen thrived, entertainers found audiences, and commoners created a vibrant, unique culture in this wooden metropolis. So there you are, futon rolled, millet eaten, sandals strapped. You step outside into the crush of Edo. Your neighbors bow politely, but you both know you heard each other snore last night. A vendor calls out for fresh chestnuts, the sweet smell luring children with copper coins. A bathhouse down the street releases puffs of steam, promising gossip and warmth later in the day. The city is already in motion, clattering, chanting, sizzling, steaming. You've barely started your morning, and Edo has already swallowed you whole. Edo mornings were not quiet, not private, not clean by modern standards, but they were alive. Every sound, every smell, every shouted vendor song reminded you that you were part of something vast and humming, a living organism built of wood, paper, and people. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life. And for them, that was enough.
Imagine the moment after you've rolled up your futon and swept the tatami mat with a flick of a reed broom. You're awake now, but your stomach is still grumbling. The question is not if you'll eat, but what you'll manage to scrape together. And in Edo, Japan, breakfast was less a meal of choice and more a brutal indicator of where you sat on the social ladder. If you were fortunate, breakfast meant rice. White, steaming, polished rice that clung to the chopsticks in sticky little pearls. Rice was prestige. Rice was power. Rice was the dream. For a wealthy merchant, a mid-ranking samurai, or even a well-connected artisan, the day began with a lacquered tray bearing a neat bowl of rice, a small dish of pickles so salty they made your mouth pucker, and a cup of cloudy miso soup. Maybe, if the gods of commerce had smiled, there was a piece of grilled fish, its skin blistered and crackling from the fire. The smell of sardines, mackerel, or eel wafted from alley kitchens, announcing the haves and the have-nots with every puff of smoke. But for most Edoites, rice was a rare indulgence, the food you dreamed of, not the food you got. What you got instead was millet or barley, a porridge that looked like it belonged in the punishment line at a prison cafeteria. Millet filled you up, yes, but it didn't impress anyone. People joked that rice was the food of the living, millet the food of the surviving. And if you've ever eaten porridge that tastes like wet cardboard, you'd understand. Yet in Edo, this was the staple of the commoner's morning. Of course, Edoites, being Edoites, they didn't just accept their fate quietly. They found ways to make millet tolerable. A drizzle of soy sauce if you could afford it, a pickle that was basically salt with a crunch, or sometimes just a desperate amount of tea poured over the top to wash it down faster. In some homes, barley mixed with whatever scraps were left from the night before. A stir-fry of odds and ends, a soup where fish heads floated, as though mocking you. And here's the odd part. The biggest city in the world, bursting with shops and markets, was often a place of hunger. Edo had to import almost all of its food. The fields within the city walls couldn't possibly sustain 1 million mouths, so barges came up the rivers loaded with rice from distant provinces. If a shipment was delayed, or if a bad harvest struck elsewhere, the price of rice spiked, and suddenly breakfast became millet for the many, and for the poorest maybe nothing at all. Famines struck often, turning the dream of rice into a cruel joke for those who could smell it but never taste it. Now picture this scene. A merchant's wife prepares breakfast. She lays out rice for her husband, neatly served in a red lacquer bowl. For herself and the children, millet, cheaper and humbler, scooped into plain wooden dishes. The father chews slowly, savoring each sticky bite. The children wolfed down their gruel, pretending not to notice. It was an open secret in many Edo households. Rice was rationed by importance, not by appetite. And yet food wasn't just survival in Edo. It was a culture. Even at breakfast, people made rituals out of the ordinary. There were prayers of thanks before the first bite. There was etiquette in how you held your chopsticks, how you bowed before lifting the bowl. Meals were as much about respect as they were about calories. But here's where things get unexpectedly modern. Edo had convenience food. If you didn't feel like cooking, or if you were too poor to keep supplies at home, you could buy your breakfast right on the street. Stalls lined the alleys with skewered tofu, roasted sweet potatoes, dumplings of rice paste, and steaming bowls of noodles. Street hawkers shouted their sales pitches at dawn, their voices carrying over the sound of clogs clattering and roosters crowing. One vendor specialized in rice bowls wrapped in seaweed, the Edo version of a grab-and-go snack. Another roasted chestnuts in an iron drum, their sweet smell floating down the street like an edible alarm clock. And there was even fast food, though it didn't look like burgers and fries. Sushi, in its earliest form, was invented in Edo as a kind of street snack, not the delicate art form you see in high-end Tokyo restaurants today, but quick, pressed bites of fish on rice sold from stalls for hungry workers. Tempura, too, was born here. Battered bits of fish or vegetables fried quickly and handed over on scraps of paper. Imagine construction workers in the morning munching on tempura the way we devour gas station burritos. Of course, not everyone approved. The government occasionally issued edicts against luxury food for commoners. Too much rice, too much fried fish, too much indulgence was frowned upon. But banning good food has never worked in human history. People ignored the rules, bought what they wanted, and quietly rebelled against the idea that millet was all they deserved. And while we're here, let's not forget sake. Yes, alcohol in the morning. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unthinkable either. Sake was considered nutritious, almost medicinal, so a cup with breakfast wasn't unheard of. Imagine starting your workday with a shot of warm rice wine, not exactly frowned upon in Edo's alleys. Now let's step into your shoes again. You're sitting cross-legged on a tatami mat. A small wooden tray is in front of you. If you're lucky, there's a steaming bowl of rice, pickles cut into delicate shapes, a cup of tea sending up little wisps of steam. If you're less lucky, there's a lump of millet staring back at you like a punishment. You pick up your chopsticks, murmur a quiet itadakimasu, and begin. Outside, the streets are waking up. The tofu seller sings his pitch, the smell of grilled sardines wafts from the neighbors, and your stomach reminds you that whatever you've got, it will have to carry you through a long day of work.
Now that you've managed to fill your stomach and step into the day, there's another question hanging over you in Edo. What are you wearing? Not in the casual fashion influencer sense, but in the very literal, very dangerous sense. Because in this city, the wrong fabric, the wrong pattern, even the wrong shade of purple could get you fined, humiliated, or dragged into the magistrate's office for breaking the law. You see, Edo was obsessed with order. Not just laws about crime or fire prevention, but laws about appearances. The shogunate issued what were called sumptuary regulations, rules designed to keep people looking like they belonged to their social rank. Clothing wasn't just fashion here, it was politics stitched into silk. If you were a samurai, you had your two swords and your subdued robes. Merchants, though often wealthier than samurai, weren't supposed to flaunt their wealth. Their kimono had to be plain, their colors dull, their fabrics humble. Heaven forbid a fishmonger strut down the street in a robe fit for a daimyo. That wasn't just a bad look, it was a punishable offense. But of course, humans being humans, no one followed these rules to the letter. Merchants got creative. They wore drab outer layers to pass inspections, but lined their kimono with outrageous silks that burst with color when they sat down or when the wind cut a sleeve. It was fashion as rebellion, subtle enough to avoid punishment, flamboyant enough to signal status to anyone paying attention. Imagine working in an office where your boss forbids flashy clothes, so you wear a gray suit, but the inside lining is covered in neon flames. That was Edo. And let's talk about the colors themselves. Purple was especially forbidden for commoners, not just because it was expensive, but because it symbolized power. The dye came from a plant called gromwell and was so difficult to produce that wearing it was like strutting around in pure gold. Commoners were banned from it, but naturally, they found ways to sneak it in. A sash, a hair tie, even just a few threads woven into a collar. Little rebellions against a system obsessed with appearances. It wasn't just color either. Certain patterns were restricted. Exotic designs, bold prints, extravagant embroidery, all things a commoner wasn't supposed to touch. The authorities imagined a world where social order was visible at a glance. The samurai stern and subdued, the merchants modest, the peasants plain. But walk through Edo's markets and you'd find people bending those rules in 1,000 inventive ways. Plain cotton dyed with deep indigo, humble fabrics cut in elegant shapes, subtle stripes that revealed wealth only to a trained eye. And while men dressed carefully, women turned fashion into an art form. Edo women's hairstyles alone were architectural marvels. Piled high, pinned with ornate combs, lacquered into place, sometimes so heavy that they made the neck ache. These hairstyles weren't just pretty, they were a public performance. A geisha's hair announced her profession. A merchant's daughter's style could hint at her family's wealth, even if her kimono was officially plain. Entire fashion subcultures emerged around these hairstyles, with manuals, illustrations, and trends shifting almost as quickly as they do on TikTok today. But fashion wasn't only about elegance, it was about survival. Fires ripped through Edo constantly, and when a blaze broke out, your wardrobe could mean life or death. Silk might burn quickly, cotton was sturdier. People often kept their most precious kimono packed in bundles, ready to be hauled out the door if the flames came too close. Owning too many luxurious robes was a risk, not just of fines, but of losing everything in the next firestorm. And there's another layer to this story: clothing as currency. Fabric was valuable enough to serve as inheritance, dowry, even collateral. A kimono wasn't just something you wore, it was a bank account you carried on your back. Merchants stored wealth in rolls of fabric. Families passed robes down through generations, restitching them, resizing them, even recycling them into children's clothes or house linings when they wore out. Nothing went to waste. Even in fashion, Edo was efficient. But let's not romanticize too much. Not everyone was strutting around in silk-lined robes. The majority wore cotton, hemp, or other simple fibers. The smell of indigo dye was everywhere, a deep, earthy scent that clung to the city's working clothes. Indigo was cheap, durable, insect-resistant, and it masked stains well. For the average Edoite, fashion meant choosing between stripes or checks, not between brocade and embroidery. But even within those limits, people carved out identity: a certain shade of blue, a cleverly tied sash, a hairstyle just trendy enough to raise eyebrows. And of course, the city was watching. Authorities actually sent out inspectors to enforce clothing laws. Imagine a kind of fashion police roaming the streets, ready to scold or fine you for wearing the wrong fabric. Some commoners were humiliated publicly, their luxurious robes confiscated, their status paraded as an example of what not to wear. It was fashion under surveillance, centuries before hashtags and paparazzi. But here's the thing: rules always lose to creativity. Edo streets were alive with hidden silks, whispered trends, subtle rebellions stitched under the surface. Fashion thrived not in spite of the restrictions, but because of them. The tighter the rules, the more ingenious the people became. That's why today, when we look at Edo prints, those ukiyo-e portraits of courtesans, kabuki actors, merchants in their robes, we don't just see what they wore, we see how they played the game. So when you walk out of your house in Edo, sandals clacking, sleeves swaying, Every stitch of fabric is saying something about your class, your wealth, your daring, your willingness to bend the rules without ever quite getting caught.
The air of Edo is never truly quiet. Even before the sun climbs too high, the city hums with a rhythm of shouts, clatters, and footsteps. If fashion tells people who you are, the market tells them how you live. And in Edo, you can't escape the market. It comes to you, whether you want it or not. Step outside your home, and the first thing you hear isn't birdsong, but voices. Vendors announcing their goods with carefully practiced cries. Each trade had its own call, like a brand jingle. The tofu seller's voice was different from the sweet potato seller's, who was different from the fishmonger, the tea vendor, the knife sharpener. They weren't just yelling randomly. These were recognizable soundscapes, so distinct that an Edoite lying half asleep could tell what was for sale just by the pitch of the cry. Forget online shopping. This was subscription delivery with surround sound. And what was for sale? Pretty much everything. Imagine you're hungry, too lazy to cook, too poor to waste firewood, or maybe just craving something you can't make at home. A man passes by with steaming skewers of grilled eel, the smoky, savory scent curling in the morning air. Another hawks bowls of noodles, portable fast food centuries before the word even existed. Sweet potato sellers sing their cries in a melodic tone, carrying hot roasted tubers wrapped in paper, cheap, filling, and comforting on a chilly morning. Markets weren't contained in neat squares like you might picture in Europe. Edo's commerce spilled into the streets. Some neighborhoods had organized morning markets, others hosted night ones that flickered by lantern light. Bridges often doubled as trading hubs, their wooden planks thrumming with the footsteps of buyers and sellers alike. And in a city as crowded as Edo, the smells alone told you where you were. Dried fish near Nihonbashi, fresh vegetables in the outer districts, the sharp tang of soy sauce drifting from storehouses along the canals. Let's not sugarcoat it. These markets weren't exactly hygienic. Fish scales glistened on wooden boards, attracting flies. Buckets of eels wriggled impatiently, splashing water onto the street. Smoked bonito, dried sardines, heaps of radishes and leeks lay in open air, sometimes dusted with ash from a nearby fire, sometimes brushed by a rat that scurried too close. You might wrinkle your nose, but Edoites? They shrugged and bargained. When you live in a city of 1 million people without refrigeration, you stop being picky. But the markets weren't just about survival. They were about theater. Sellers weren't anonymous faces behind stalls. They were performers. They knew how to slice a tuna in full view, how to arrange vegetables in neat pyramids, how to charm customers with jokes or scold them into buying. Some even became minor celebrities. Picture your favorite food truck owner, except instead of a truck, it's a cart with wooden wheels creaking down the street, and instead of Instagram followers, they're immortalized in ukiyo-e prints. And the food itself? Edo was famous for its variety. Sushi, for example, wasn't the delicate art form we know today. Back then, it was fast food. Big blocks of vinegared rice topped with slices of preserved fish, something you grabbed quickly and ate standing. Tempura was another street staple, sold hot and crispy, fried in sesame oil that perfumed the whole block. Even soba noodles were often slurped standing at a stall, served in steaming bowls for a few coins. It wasn't about sitting down for a meal, it was about feeding yourself between errands, grabbing flavor on the go. But it wasn't just food. The streets swarmed with other sellers, firewood vendors balancing heavy bundles, lantern sellers hawking paper globes painted with family crests, even second-hand kimono traders offering clothing for those who couldn't afford new. Children trailed sellers of sweets, sticky rice cakes, chestnut candies, treats glazed with sugar or honey. Edo had no shortage of toothaches waiting to happen. And then there were the oddities. Goldfish sellers carried bowls filled with darting red fish, ready to brighten up a home.
Puppet sellers juggled their stock by entertaining kids on the spot. Herbalists hawked mysterious powders and tonics, promising everything from longer life to better digestion. You might doubt their science, but when your diet consisted mostly of rice and pickled vegetables, you probably tried a few. Of course, the bustle had a darker side. Pickpockets loved the markets. With so many hands reaching for coins, it was easy to slip one away unnoticed. And disputes weren't rare either. A merchant accused of false weights, a fishmonger caught selling bad stock. Arguments could erupt, voices rising until a constable appeared with a stern face and a wooden baton, ready to restore order. Yet for all its chaos, the market was the pulse of Edo. Here, a samurai brushing past in need of quick food might find himself shoulder to shoulder with a peasant buying pickles. Boundaries blurred. Money spoke louder than rank, at least for a moment. If fashion was carefully policed, the market was where life spilled over the rules, messy, noisy, alive. And here's the thing. Edo's obsession with food shaped Japanese culture itself. The city's demand for fresh fish gave rise to enormous distribution networks, fishing villages working overtime to keep Edo fed. The constant craving for rice spurred barges to float down rivers from distant provinces. Soy sauce became a staple, its salty, umami punch defining the taste of Edo cuisine. What began as local street life ended up laying the foundation for national traditions. So as you wander the market, ducking past a cart, holding your sleeve to your nose against a whiff of rotting fish, you're not just shopping. You're part of a citywide performance, a ritual that keeps a million stomachs satisfied and a million tempers soothed. And if you're clever, you might even pick up gossip along with your groceries. Who's marrying who, which kabuki actor's latest scandal has the city buzzing, whether rice prices are climbing. The market was also the news feed of Edo, every shout and rumor tumbling together into the day's story. By the time you return home, your arms full, your ears ringing with vendors' cries, you've done more than shop. You've stepped into the heartbeat of a city that lived by trade, survived on food that traveled by boat and cart, and celebrated its identity in every steaming skewer, every bright fabric roll, every noisy haggling match. And tomorrow, it will all happen again.
By the time the sun begins to slide down over Edo, the city doesn't quiet, it transforms. The clang of merchants' voices fades, the smell of grilled eels drifts off, and a different kind of sound rises. Drums, flutes, chatter, the laughter of crowds who've worked, bargained, eaten, and are now ready for something else entirely. In a city packed with people, entertainment wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. And nothing embodied Edo's love of spectacle quite like the theater. Now, when I say theater, don't picture velvet seats, polite applause, or programs handed out at the door. No, Edo's kabuki theaters were noisy, messy, alive. They were arenas of sound and color, places where everyone, samurai, merchants, peasants, women sneaking in under cover, crowded together for hours on end to be dazzled, shocked, and occasionally scandalized. Kabuki itself began in the early 1600s thanks to a woman named Izumo no Okuni, who put on eccentric performances with song and dance that blended religion, parody, and spectacle. But by the Edo period, Kabuki had exploded into a cultural juggernaut. And of course, because humans can't leave anything fun alone, the authorities banned women from performing, claiming it was indecent, which is ironic since it was precisely the indecency that had made Kabuki popular. Boys took over the roles for a while, then men, leading to the tradition of onagata, male actors specializing in female roles, painted and powdered until their gestures and voices embodied idealized femininity. Imagine it. The curtain rises, if you can even see the curtain through the haze of pipe smoke.
On stage, actors appear in towering wigs, faces painted stark white with crimson lines, costumes exploding with color and embroidery. Their movements are stylized, every step deliberate, every turn of the head choreographed to send the audience into gasps or cheers. The dialogue might be hard to follow, dense, poetic, filled with cultural references, but that hardly mattered. You came for the spectacle. And spectacle you got. Kabuki plays weren't short affairs. Some lasted all day, with multiple acts covering history, love stories, revenge dramas, and supernatural encounters. Vendors circulated the aisles selling snacks, rice cakes, dried squid, tea, so you wouldn't starve while watching. Families brought children. Merchants did deals in the back rows. People shouted out the names of their favorite actors mid-performance, a tradition called kakegoe, like a fan scream at a rock concert. Quiet respect wasn't the vibe, participation was. But kabuki wasn't just entertainment. It was a mirror of Edo life. Many plays dramatized famous events or scandals, thinly disguised with new names. If a high-ranking samurai committed a shocking crime, you could be sure that within weeks, some kabuki troupe would be reenacting it on stage, with exaggerated costumes and dramatic monologues. Censorship was strict, so playwrights often set these stories in the distant past or in China, but everyone in the audience knew what was really being referenced. It was the city's gossip mill, dressed in silk and makeup. And the actors were stars, not just performers, but celebrities. Their portraits appeared in woodblock prints that sold like posters or trading cards. Merchants decorated their homes with images of their favorite actors, the same way someone today might put up a movie poster or save wallpapers on their phone. The most popular actors could spark fashion trends overnight. A way of tying a sash, a certain hairstyle, even the angle of a glance. If an actor did it, the streets of Edo soon echoed it. Of course, fame came with frenzy. Actors were stalked by fans, showered with gifts, sometimes entangled in scandals so notorious they became plays themselves. Sound familiar? Celebrity culture didn't start with Hollywood, Edo did it first. But kabuki wasn't the only game in town. Edo also pulsed with other forms of entertainment. Bunraku Puppet Theater told epic tales with astonishingly intricate puppets, their movements controlled by 3 puppeteers visible on stage, while narrators and shamisen players provided the voices in music. Street performers worked crowds with juggling, magic tricks, or animal shows. And let's not forget sumo wrestling, already popular in Edo, drawing crowds to watch massive men clash with ritual precision. But kabuki reigned supreme. Its theaters in districts like Asakusa or Nihonbashi were magnets for everyone with a few coins to spare and a few hours to kill. And they weren't just theaters, they were neighborhoods unto themselves. Around the playhouses clustered tea houses, food stalls, shops selling souvenirs, prints, and trinkets. Going to kabuki wasn't just seeing a play, it was an all-day festival, a social outing, a chance to rub shoulders with strangers and friends alike. And yet, like everything in Edo, there was a dark edge. Fires were a constant threat. The theaters, built of wood, packed with people and oil lamps, went up in flames again and again. Entire districts burned down because of a single spark in a kabuki playhouse. Still, each time they rebuilt. Entertainment was too important to abandon, too central to the heartbeat of Edo. Think about it. A city ruled by strict social order, where laws dictated what you could wear, where merchants had to bow to samurai. But in the theater, that hierarchy bent. A merchant could sit closer to the stage than a low-ranking samurai if he paid for it. A woman might sneak in disguised. A farmer on holiday could sit in the cheap seats and lose himself in a world of dazzling costumes and bloody revenge plots. Kabuki was a place where, for a few hours, life's rigid lines blurred and the city's imagination could run wild. By the time you stumble out of the theater, the stars pricking the sky above Edo, your ears still ringing with drums and your nose filled with the faint tang of smoke and fried snacks, you feel transformed, not because the story was uplifting, but because you shared it with a crowd of thousands. You lived in a city that thrived on noise, on spectacle, on collective experience. Tomorrow the markets would shout again, the inspectors would scold someone for a too bright robe, and the authorities would frown at another scandal. But tonight belonged to the actors, the stage, and the city that refused to be quiet.
Leaving the kabuki theater, your ears still ringing from drums and cheers, you follow the current of people spilling into the streets. The sky's dark now. Lanterns swinging on poles, their warm glow flickering against wooden walls. Edo doesn't go to sleep. Not yet. If the theater was the city's stage for spectacle, then the nightlife districts were its stage for desire. And none were more famous, or infamous, than Yoshiwara. Now, Yoshiwara wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the neighborhood, a walled-in district sanctioned by the government for one purpose: to contain and control the city's brothels. Yes, the authorities who banned purple dye and scolded merchants for fancy robes decided it was best to regulate pleasure instead of pretending it didn't exist. Better to build a playground and fence it in than have desire spill chaotically across the city. So Yoshiwara rose, a kind of fantasy city within the city. By day, the gates might look quiet, but by night, lanterns lit its streets like constellations. Shops, tea houses, brothels, all arranged in an orderly grid, a bizarre blend of strict regulation and wild indulgence. You couldn't just wander in drunk and grab a girl. There was ritual, hierarchy, performance. Even pleasure had rules in Edo. And at the center of it all were the courtesans. Don't picture them as simply sex workers. The highest-ranking courtesans, known as oiran, were cultural celebrities in their own right. They weren't only expected to entertain men in private. They had to dazzle in conversation, compose poetry, play music, dance, and demonstrate refined taste. Landing time with an oiran wasn't just about lust. It was about status. It meant you had enough wealth and wit to impress someone trained to outshine you. And then there was the spectacle of their appearance. Oiran were walking works of art. Towering hairstyles weighed down with combs and hairpins, elaborate silk robes layered upon layers, white sashes tied in front instead of the back. A deliberate signal of their profession. When an oiran walked the streets in a formal procession, flanked by attendants, the crowd pressed in just to see. It was theater on the street. Desire turned into performance. But not everyone could afford such luxuries. Most visitors to Yoshiwara ended up in the tea houses or the lower-ranked establishments, where the courtesans had fewer silks, fewer fans, and fewer rules. Still, the ritual remained. You didn't just pick someone like ordering food at a stall. There were introductions, gifts, negotiations. It was part of the game, the illusion that this wasn't a transaction but a romance. And the illusion mattered. In a city where class was rigid, Yoshiwara offered fantasy. A lowly clerk could step into a tea house, sip sake, and imagine himself equal to a samurai, at least for a few hours. A merchant could flaunt his wealth without inspectors wagging their fingers. Men indulged, but women too. Some courtesans became legends, immortalized in woodblock prints and poems, admired by both genders. Yoshiwara wasn't just about sex, it was about escapism. A carefully built dream world where the harshness of daily life softened under lantern light. Of course, the dream had shadows. Disease spread quickly, and lives of courtesans were often brutally short. Many were sold into the district as children, bound by debt contracts they might never escape. Behind the silk and music was the hard reality of exploitation. Visitors saw beauty. Those inside knew cages. Even the oiran, at the top of the hierarchy, rarely left Yoshiwara once they entered into it. The gates that glowed with lanterns at night locked them in just as much as they invited men in. Yet for all its darkness, Yoshiwara thrived. And not just because of desire. It was also a hub of culture. Fashion trends began there, with hairstyles and kimono styles flowing from courtesans to the wider city. Poetry circles flourished, with witty verses traded over sake. Artists and writers flocked to capture the atmosphere in prints and stories. The so-called floating world, ukiyo, was born from this culture. A world of fleeting pleasures, captured in art that still fascinates us today. And Yoshiwara wasn't the only nightlife option. For those without the coin, and there were many, the city streets offered cheaper thrills. Bathhouses doubled as social hubs, where steam, chatter, and occasional flirtations blurred the lines of propriety. Puppet shows and storytelling sessions entertained crowds in open-air stalls. Sumo matches, fireworks displays, and seasonal festivals gave people something to cheer for without the cost of a courtesan's time. Even food played its part in nightlife. Imagine wandering past stalls frying tempura in hot oil, their sizzle echoing in the night air, or sellers pouring cups of sweet amatsake, a low-alcohol rice drink, warming cold hands and loosening tongues. For the less refined, there was plenty of cheap sake, strong, rough, and guaranteed to leave you stumbling by the canals. Edo nights were filled with laughter, arguments, music, and occasionally someone passed out on a bridge until morning. And yet it all tied together. The kabuki theaters, the tea houses, the pleasure quarters, the street stalls, all together they created a rhythm of release. Edo was a city of 1 million people crammed into wooden houses, ruled by strict hierarchies, threatened constantly by fire, famine, or flood. Without release, the city would burst. Nightlife wasn't just entertainment. It was pressure release, survival disguised as indulgence. So as you follow the lantern-lit path through Yoshiwara, past courtesans in their shimmering robes, past gamblers whispering over dice, past drunken clerks laughing too loudly, you feel the pull of the floating world. A place where rules bend, where dreams flicker bright and brief, where life's weight seems lighter, even if only for until morning. And when the lanterns go out and the gates close, Edo awakes again to its markets, its samurai, its strict inspectors. But for one night, you've seen the city at its most dazzling and its most human.
By morning, the lanterns of Yoshiwara are snuffed out. The smoke of grilled skewers is faded, and Edo returns to its daily rhythm. But not everyone is heading to the market or the bathhouse. Some are headed to face the magistrate. Because beneath all the floating world glamour, Edo was a city obsessed with law and order, and when that order broke, punishment was not subtle. Here's the first surprise. Edo wasn't a lawless city, quite the opposite. For all its size, 1 million people crammed into wooden streets and alleys, crime rates were relatively low compared to other pre-modern cities. Why? Partly because everyone was watching everyone else. Neighborhoods were organized into tight units called gonin-gumi, groups of 5 households tied together. If one person committed a crime, the others were expected to report it or risk being punished themselves. Imagine your neighbor sneaking out with stolen rice and you thinking, if I don't tell, we all get flogged. Snitches weren't just encouraged, they were mandatory. But of course, crime still happened. Petty theft was common, pickpockets at the markets, burglars slipping through paper walls, con men tricking merchants. Firewood was often stolen, not glamorous, but essential. And sometimes bigger crimes erupted. Violent brawls, gambling rings, even samurai cutting down commoners in fits of temper, an abuse known as kirisute gomen, literally the permission to cut and leave. Yes, you heard that right. A samurai, if he felt insulted by a commoner, could in theory cut him down on the spot. But before you picture Edo streets running red every time a merchant gave side-eye, know this. In practice, it wasn't so easy. Samurai had to justify the act later to magistrates, and if it seemed petty or cruel, they could be punished themselves. Still, the fact that the law allowed it says everything about Edo's rigid hierarchy. One wrong word to the wrong man, and you might pay with your life.
And then there were organized gangs. Edo had its share of Yakuza-like groups, gamblers and toughs who ran protection rackets in markets and taverns. They weren't the mafia empires of modern imagination, but they were feared enough that ordinary citizens crossed the street when they saw tattooed men with swaggering stances. Authorities cracked down when gangs grew too bold, but in a city this size, shadows always found space to thrive. So what happened when you got caught? That's when Edo's justice revealed its true theater. Magistrates, stern men appointed by the shogunate, presided over cases, often holding sessions in open view. People crowded in to watch. Justice in Edo wasn't private, it was performance, meant to scare as much as to settle. Punishments varied by crime and class. A thief might be paraded through the streets with a placard hanging from his neck, his crime written for all to see. Lesser offenses could bring flogging or exile. But for more serious crimes, Edo did not play around. Beheadings were public events. Execution grounds like Suzugamore, just outside the city, were infamous for their brutality. Criminals were marched out in procession, crowds gathering to watch, vendors selling food and drinks as if it were a festival. The condemned might be forced to write a death poem before the blade fell. Yes, even execution demanded art. Others were crucified, tied to wooden crosses and dispatched with spears. Arsonists, considered especially dangerous in a city of wood and paper, were burned alive. The message was clear. Crime threatened the fragile order of Edo, and order would be restored with fire and blood. And yet, punishments weren't only about fear. They were about spectacle. Just as kabuki entertained, executions reinforced the shogunate's authority through shock. Crowds remembered the sight. Parents dragged children along to watch, saying, "See, that's what happens if you steal." It was horror as public service announcement. But it wasn't all blood and terror. Edo justice also relied on shame. Humiliation could be as effective as death. Being paraded in disgrace, having your head shaved, being exiled to distant provinces, these punishments tore away honor, which in a culture obsessed with face and reputation was often worse than pain. For samurai, forced seppuku, ritual suicide, preserved a shred of dignity, but it was still a grim spectacle, performed under official supervision. And then there were prisons. Edo's prisons weren't sprawling complexes like today. They were often temporary holding spaces, damp, dark, filled with the stench of sweat and human waste. Prisoners chained together, some waiting trial, others waiting execution. Disease spread easily. Survival was uncertain. You didn't want to end up there, not for long. Still, despite the severity, crime persisted in small, everyday ways. People gambled in back rooms, even though gambling was officially banned. Prostitutes worked outside Yoshiwara, evading inspectors. Black markets thrived, selling stolen goods or smuggled luxuries. Edo citizens knew the rules, but they also knew how to bend them. The city survived in the balance between strict order and sly disobedience. And here's the irony. For all the brutality, people still joked about crime. Satirical prints mocked corrupt officials. Storytellers spun comic tales of bumbling thieves outwitted by clever commoners. Crime became entertainment, just like kabuki. Another reminder that Edo never took itself entirely too seriously. Picture it. You're in a crowd, watching a thief march through the streets with a wooden placard hanging around his neck. People jeer, laugh, throw things. The magistrate's men bark orders. You know it's supposed to scare you straight, but part of you is entertained. In a city where fire, famine, and disease always loomed, maybe laughing at punishment was its own kind of survival. And so Edo balanced itself. Strict laws, brutal justice, but also humor, spectacle,
and the ever-present ingenuity of its people. Because no matter how rigid the shogunate's control, life in Edo was always a game of bending rules without breaking them, or at least not getting caught.
You wake up in the middle of the night to shouting. At first, you think it's another drunk staggering home from a tavern, but then you smell it. Smoke, thick and choking, seeping through the cracks in your wooden shutters. Someone is pounding on a drum in the distance, a signal. Someone else is ringing a bell. You throw open the sliding door and see it, the sky glowing red. Welcome to Edo, the city that burned. If you lived here in the 17th or 18th century, fire wasn't an occasional tragedy, it was practically a season. Edo was built like a tinderbox, houses of wood, walls of paper, roofs thatched or shingled, lanterns with open flames, stoves burning charcoal, winter nights warmed by hibachi braziers. Add in 1 million people packed into narrow alleys, and you had a recipe for disaster. The worst came in 1657, the Great Fire of Meireki. It raged for 3 days, devouring nearly 2/3 of the city. Over 100,000 people died. Let that number sit for a second. More than the population of some entire European capitals at the time. The firestorm was so intense that people drowned in the Sumida River trying to escape, their bodies piling up against bridges. The aftermath was apocalyptic, smoldering ruins as far as the eye could see, survivors wandering in shock. And yet, within weeks, Edo began to rebuild, because what else could they do? This was the shogun's capital. Abandonment wasn't an option. Fires like that earned Edo the grim nickname, the City of Fires. They even had a saying, fires and quarrels are the flowers of Edo. Beautiful, destructive, inevitable. And because fire struck so often, the city developed its own special class of heroes, the Hikeshi. Don't picture modern firefighters with hoses and helmets. These were tough gangs of men armed with hooks, ladders, and buckets. Their main job wasn't to put out flames, almost impossible once a blaze got going in Edo's tightly packed neighborhoods, but to tear down buildings around the fire, creating fire breaks to stop the spread. Imagine charging toward a burning house, not to douse it, but to rip it apart before it could set the next block alight. Heroic? Yes. Popular? Extremely. Dangerous? Always. The Hikeshi wore thick coats soaked in water, decorated with elaborate stitched patterns. Before charging into a fire, they doused themselves in water until their uniforms dripped and froze. These coats became a kind of fashion statement, bold designs that showed off bravery. People admired firefighters like rock stars. Woodblock prints celebrated them. Songs praised them. Young men wanted to join, not just for duty, but for swagger. And yet, firefighting was also politics. Different brigades protected different neighborhoods, and rivalry often flared. Firefights sometimes turned into brawls between teams. Imagine firefighters throwing punches in the middle of an inferno while half the city was going up in flames. Very Edo. But fire wasn't the only disaster lurking. Edo was built on a floodplain, crossed by rivers and canals. In heavy rains or typhoons, the Sumida River swelled, banks overflowed, and whole districts were submerged. Imagine trudging through knee-deep water, your sandals slipping, your futon soaked, your rice spoiled. Floods didn't kill as dramatically as fire, but they made life miserable, spreading disease, destroying food stores, leaving mold creeping up paper walls. And then there were earthquakes. Japan sits on shifting tectonic plates, and Edo felt the tremors. Buildings rattled, walls cracked, shelves toppled. The big one came in 1703, the Ganroku earthquake.
which devastated Edo and surrounding regions, killing over 100,000. Fires followed, because of course they did. In Edo, disasters loved to arrive in pairs. How did people cope? With rituals, prayers, and sheer resilience. Temples held ceremonies to ward off disaster gods. Shrines dedicated to fire protection were popular. People bought charms, hung protective amulets, but mostly they accepted that catastrophe was woven into Edo life. You built your house knowing it might burn. You saved money knowing flood or quake might take everything. And then you rebuilt, again and again. Disaster also shaped the city itself. After the Great Fire of Meireki, authorities redesigned Edo's layout, wider streets to act as fire breaks, designated empty lots as fire prevention spaces, even relocating temples and shrines to create buffer zones. It was urban planning by trial and error, with tragedy as teacher. And yet, people joked about it. Satirical poems compared fires to spring blossoms, short-lived, beautiful in their own way, leaving the city refreshed. Imagine losing your home and still writing a witty haiku about it. That was the Edo spirit. Dark humor as survival tool. Let's not forget the smells, the sounds. A fire meant smoke stinging your eyes, the crack of timber splitting, the roar of flames like a giant's breath. Floods meant the stench of stagnant water, mold blooming and fish gasping in puddles where streets used to be. Earthquakes? The rumble like a drum beat under your feet, bowls and lanterns crashing around you. Edo life wasn't quiet. It was a symphony of danger. And yet, here's the twist. Disaster also fueled culture. Fire brigades inspired art and theater. Rebuilding after fires drove innovation in carpentry, design, even fashion. People bought new clothes, new furniture, new prints after each calamity. The constant cycle of loss and renewal gave Edo that restless, vibrant energy. It was never static, always in motion, always rebuilding. So, as you stand on a bridge in Edo, watching smoke curl into the sky or water rise past the banks, you realize something. This city doesn't just survive disaster, it's defined by it. Edo without fire would be unthinkable, like a stage without actors. And somehow, people lived not in fear, but in rhythm with the destruction, laughing, rebuilding, and waiting for the next time the bells rang.
You're hungry. Not the sort of hunger that hits you after skipping lunch, but the everyday gnawing kind that followed most Edo townsfolk around like a stray dog. Because while Edo had food, and plenty of it, meals were not the grand feasts you might picture when you think of a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people. Most of the time, food in Edo was simple, repetitive, and deeply symbolic of status. Let's start with rice, the holy grain, the obsession, the beating heart of Edo. But here's the catch. Not everyone could afford it. Rice wasn't just food, it was money. Samurai were literally paid in rice stipends, measured in koku, enough to feed one person for a year. The wealthier you were, the more rice you could eat without thinking twice. For the poor, however, rice was often a dream. They filled their bowls with barley, millet, or buckwheat instead, grains that didn't carry the same prestige. Eating pure white rice marked you as someone with means. But eating nothing but polished rice also came with a hidden cost. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency. Edo's elite literally grew sick from showing off their wealth through food. So, what did your average Edo resident actually eat day to day? Breakfast was often a humble bowl of rice, or millet if you were unlucky, miso soup, and pickles. Lunch and dinner didn't stray far from the same formula, maybe with some grilled fish, tofu, or seasonal vegetables added in if fortune smiled on you. The vegetables were often simmered in soy sauce and dashi, or pickled until they practically hummed with sourness. People in Edo loved pickles, radish, eggplant, cucumbers, even mountain greens. Why? Because pickles didn't spoil, and they brightened up an otherwise bland meal. Fish was the real star of Edo dining. Living by the bay meant markets overflowed with seafood, eels, sardines, bonito, tuna. Edoites had a particular fondness for unagi, freshwater eel, grilled and glazed with sweet soy sauce, smoky and rich. It was thought to restore stamina in the humid summer months. Street stalls popped up selling skewered eels, the smell alone enough to draw a crowd. Imagine walking through narrow lanes at twilight, smoke rising from grills, the sizzling hiss of fat dripping onto coals. If you've ever stopped in a food truck after work, you'd understand the pull. Another Edo favorite was soba noodles. Cheap, filling, and quick to prepare, soba became the fast food of its time. Vendors carried yokes across their shoulders, steaming baskets of noodles dangling from each end, setting up shop wherever there were hungry mouths. For a few coins, you could get a hot bowl of soba splashed with broth, or cold noodles dipped into soy sauce. Students, merchants, laborers all slurped noodles noisily in the street, because silence would mean you weren't enjoying it properly. Edo nights echoed with the sound of slurping. Then there was sushi, though not the delicate art form you might picture today. Edo's sushi was bold, practical, and enormous. Known as Edomai zushi, it began as street food. Thick slabs of fresh fish pressed onto balls of vinegared rice, meant to be grabbed and eaten on the go. It was fast, filling, and designed for a city that never slowed down. Imagine a slice of tuna the size of your palm, slapped on rice and handed over like a burger. That was Edo sushi. Refined? No. Addictive? Absolutely. Of course, not all Edo dining was so savory. Street sweets were everywhere. Sticky rice cakes, roasted chestnuts, skewered dumplings dripping with soy glaze. Children swarmed around vendors selling kuzumorchi, fermented starch jelly, or manju, sweet buns filled with bean paste. Adults weren't above indulging either, especially during festivals. Picture the sticky fingers, the sugar rush, and the inevitable regret. Human nature hasn't changed much. Now, drinking. Sake flowed freely in Edo, served warm in winter and cool in summer. Taverns were packed with townsfolk crammed shoulder to shoulder, sipping from tiny cups, nibbling on salty snacks designed to make you thirstier. Think of it like the Japanese version of tapas culture. Small bites like dried squid, pickled plums, or salted fish guts. The sort of thing that sounds unappealing until you've had 2 drinks, and suddenly it's the best thing you've ever tasted. Sake wasn't just for relaxation, it was social glue, a way to seal deals, mend quarrels, or drown sorrows when disaster struck, which in Edo it often did. Dining, however, was also about rules. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict social hierarchies, and food reflected that. Samurai dined with more variety, merchants showed off their wealth with elaborate banquets, and commoners made do with what they could stretch. But here's the twist. Edo's rigid laws also created a thriving underground of culinary creativity. Ordinary people weren't supposed to flaunt luxury, so they hid it in their kitchens. A plainer-looking kimono might hide a fine lining. A modest home might host a feast behind closed doors. Food became a subtle rebellion, a way to taste freedom without openly breaking the rules. And let's not forget the seasons. Edo cuisine was deeply tied to the cycle of nature. Spring meant bamboo shoots and fresh greens. Summer brought eel and cold noodles. Autumn meant chestnuts and mushrooms. Winter brought hot pots simmering with tofu and root vegetables. Eating seasonally wasn't just about freshness, it was survival. No refrigeration meant you ate what the land and sea offered when it offered it. That rhythm gave Edo food a kind of poetry, a constant reminder of time passing. Of course, life in a city of over 1 million also meant waste. Fish guts piled up at markets, the smell hanging in the humid air. Rice chaff and vegetable peels rotted in alleys. But here, Edo shows surprising foresight. Much of its waste was recycled. Farmers collected night soil, yes, human waste, from the city to use as fertilizer. Nothing went unused. Imagine paying someone to haul away your waste because it was literally worth money to farmers outside the city. Edo wasn't just a hungry city, it was an efficient one. So what did all this eating feel like? Imagine biting into hot grilled eel on a sticky summer night, the sauce sweet and charred. Or slurping cold soba on a sweltering day, dipping it into soy broth that smells of seaweed and dried fish. Imagine the crunch of pickled radish cutting through a mouthful of rice, the sharp tang of sake, the sweetness of bean paste lingering on your tongue. Edo was a city that lived through its stomach, even if that stomach often grumbled. And in that, Edo feels familiar. Food wasn't just fuel, it was comfort, identity, community. People gathered around bowls of noodles the way we gather around pizzas or burgers. They argued about the best soba stands, gossiped in taverns, bragged about seasonal delicacies. Food was survival, but it was also joy. Even in a city where fires destroyed homes, floods ruined harvests, and disease stalked the alleys, people still found time to savor a grilled eel, a cup of sake, a ball of sushi on the run. So, as you finish your modest Edo supper, rice, soup, maybe a sliver of fish if luck is with you, you sit back and think, life is fragile, disasters loom, but for now, at least you are fed. And tomorrow, the soba seller will be back on the street, calling out in a sing-song voice, steaming bowls ready for anyone with a few coins and an empty belly.
You're hungry. Not the sort of hunger that hits you after skipping lunch, but the everyday gnawing kind that followed most Edo townsfolk around like a stray dog. Because while Edo had food, and plenty of it, meals were not the grand feasts you might picture when you think of a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people. Most of the time, food in Edo was simple, repetitive, and deeply symbolic of status. Let's start with rice, the holy grain, the obsession, the beating heart of Edo. But here's the catch. Not everyone could afford it. Rice wasn't just food, it was money. Samurai were literally paid in rice stipends, measured in koku, enough to feed one person for a year. The wealthier you were, the more rice you could eat without thinking twice. For the poor, however, rice was often a dream. They filled their bowls with barley, millet, or buckwheat instead, grains that didn't carry the same prestige. Eating pure white rice marked you as someone with means. But eating nothing but polished rice also came with a hidden cost. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency. Edo's elite literally grew sick from showing off their wealth through food. So, what did your average Edo resident actually eat day to day? Breakfast was often a humble bowl of rice, or millet if you were unlucky, miso soup, and pickles. Lunch and dinner didn't stray far from the same formula, maybe with some grilled fish, tofu, or seasonal vegetables added in if fortune smiled on you. The vegetables were often simmered in soy sauce and dashi, or pickled until they practically hummed with sourness. People in Edo loved pickles, radish, eggplant, cucumbers, even mountain greens. Why? Because pickles didn't spoil, and they brightened up an otherwise bland meal. Fish was the real star of Edo dining. Living by the bay meant markets overflowed with seafood, eels, sardines, bonito, tuna. Edoites had a particular fondness for unagi, freshwater eel, grilled and glazed with sweet soy sauce, smoky and rich. It was thought to restore stamina in the humid summer months. Street stalls popped up selling skewered eels, the smell alone enough to draw a crowd. Imagine walking through narrow lanes at twilight, smoke rising from grills, the sizzling hiss of fat dripping onto coals. If you've ever stopped in a food truck after work, you'd understand the pull. Another Edo favorite was soba noodles. Cheap, filling, and quick to prepare, soba became the fast food of its time. Vendors carried yokes across their shoulders, steaming baskets of noodles dangling from each end, setting up shop wherever there were hungry mouths. For a few coins, you could get a hot bowl of soba splashed with broth, or cold noodles dipped into soy sauce. Students, merchants, laborers all slurped noodles noisily in the street, because silence would mean you weren't enjoying it properly. Edo nights echoed with the sound of slurping. Then there was sushi, though not the delicate art form you might picture today. Edo's sushi was bold, practical, and enormous. Known as Edomai zushi, it began as street food. Thick slabs of fresh fish pressed onto balls of vinegared rice, meant to be grabbed and eaten on the go. It was fast, filling, and designed for a city that never slowed down. Imagine a slice of tuna the size of your palm, slapped on rice and handed over like a burger. That was Edo sushi.
Refined? No. Addictive? Absolutely. Of course, not all Edo dining was so savory. Street sweets were everywhere. Sticky rice cakes, roasted chestnuts, skewered dumplings dripping with soy glaze. Children swarmed around vendors selling kuzumorchi, fermented starch jelly, or manju, sweet buns filled with bean paste. Adults weren't above indulging either, especially during festivals. Picture the sticky fingers, the sugar rush, and the inevitable regret. Human nature hasn't changed much. Now, drinking. Sake flowed freely in Edo, served warm in winter and cool in summer. Taverns were packed with townsfolk crammed shoulder to shoulder, sipping from tiny cups, nibbling on salty snacks designed to make you thirstier. Think of it like the Japanese version of tapas culture. Small bites like dried squid, pickled plums, or salted fish guts. The sort of thing that sounds unappealing until you've had 2 drinks, and suddenly it's the best thing you've ever tasted. Sake wasn't just for relaxation, it was social glue, a way to seal deals, mend quarrels, or drown sorrows when disaster struck, which in Edo it often did. Dining, however, was also about rules. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict social hierarchies, and food reflected that. Samurai dined with more variety, merchants showed off their wealth with elaborate banquets, and commoners made do with what they could stretch. But here's the twist. Edo's rigid laws also created a thriving underground of culinary creativity. Ordinary people weren't supposed to flaunt luxury, so they hid it in their kitchens. A plainer-looking kimono might hide a fine lining. A modest home might host a feast behind closed doors. Food became a subtle rebellion, a way to taste freedom without openly breaking the rules. And let's not forget the seasons. Edo cuisine was deeply tied to the cycle of nature. Spring meant bamboo shoots and fresh greens. Summer brought eel and cold noodles. Autumn meant chestnuts and mushrooms. Winter brought hot pots simmering with tofu and root vegetables. Eating seasonally wasn't just about freshness, it was survival. No refrigeration meant you ate what the land and sea offered when it offered it. That rhythm gave Edo food a kind of poetry, a constant reminder of time passing. Of course, life in a city of over 1 million also meant waste. Fish guts piled up at markets, the smell hanging in the humid air. Rice chaff and vegetable peels rotted in alleys. But here, Edo shows surprising foresight. Much of its waste was recycled. Farmers collected night soil, yes, human waste, from the city to use as fertilizer. Nothing went unused. Imagine paying someone to haul away your waste because it was literally worth money to farmers outside the city. Edo wasn't just a hungry city, it was an efficient one. So what did all this eating feel like? Imagine biting into hot grilled eel on a sticky summer night, the sauce sweet and charred. Or slurping cold soba on a sweltering day, dipping it into soy broth that smells of seaweed and dried fish. Imagine the crunch of pickled radish cutting through a mouthful of rice, the sharp tang of sake, the sweetness of bean paste lingering on your tongue. Edo was a city that lived through its stomach, even if that stomach often grumbled. And in that, Edo feels familiar. Food wasn't just fuel, it was comfort, identity, community. People gathered around bowls of noodles the way we gather around pizzas or burgers. They argued about the best soba stands, gossiped in taverns, bragged about seasonal delicacies. Food was survival, but it was also joy. Even in a city where fires destroyed homes, floods ruined harvests, and disease stalked the alleys, people still found time to savor a grilled eel, a cup of sake, a ball of sushi on the run. So, as you finish your modest Edo supper, rice, soup, maybe a sliver of fish if luck is with you, you sit back and think, life is fragile, disasters loom, but for now, at least you are fed. And tomorrow, the soba seller will be back on the street, calling out in a sing-song voice, steaming bowls ready for anyone with a few coins and an empty belly.